All right, so we're running live today. Today we're going to talk about the ethics of death. That's the topic this week. So what I'll go ahead and do is show you the presentation I put together for everybody. I'll begin with some introductory work, and then we'll segue and discuss a bit of the Ben Bradley that I assigned for the week. So let's go ahead and dive in. Again, hopefully everybody's doing great. And feel free at any point to let me know if you have a question or comment about something that's going on. Let me know if I can clarify anything as we go. Okay. Drop that down, scoot this over. All right, so I want to talk about death, the ethics of death, mostly, though we'll get into some other issues that are related. Just this is what ends up happening. We talk about the ethics of death, you get into other areas of philosophy pretty quickly. It's one of those cool topics that's intersubdisciplinary in that way. So we can begin thinking about the ethics of death. So if you were to pick up like a book on death and well-being, or thinking about the ethics of death, very often it's going to begin with Epicurus as this ancient philosopher who inspired a view that that maintains that death is not bad, not ever bad for the individual that dies. So the Epicurean, as we sometimes put it nowadays, the Epicurean about death maintains that death is not bad for the individual that dies. So let's see. The argument, at least one of the arguments, I think the main argument from the Epicurus is found here in this letter to Menoetius. Okay, he wrote this letter, and the source of the letter is this ancient philosopher Diogenes Laertius. So it'd be nice if we had, primary sources from Epicurus, but we rely on other ancient thinkers to get us work from Epicurus. We have very little from him, but it's a very short letter. I just wanted to show you a passage from it. So here, early on, Epicurus is trying to get us to not fear death, because he thinks that fearing death makes our lives go worse for us in various ways. I could say more about that, but I just want to get to this paragraph here. So he says, "Get used to believing that death is nothing to us, for all good and bad consists in sense experience, or all good and bad consists in experience. And death is a privation of sense experience. Death is the privation of experience. It's the end of experience. Hence, a correct knowledge of the fact of death is nothing to make us, hence a correct knowledge of the fact that death is nothing to us makes the mortality of life a matter of contentment, not by adding a limitless time to life, but by removing the longing for immortality. Death," and he understood by this physical death, "is our permanent end." So it doesn't add a limitless life to us, thinking that there's an afterlife that's going to be limitless, but rather removes this longing for immortality, because it's just going to be our end, our permanent end. "For there's nothing fearful in life for one who has grasped that there is nothing fearful in the absence of life. Thus, he is a fool, he is unwise, who says that he fears death, not because it will be painful when present, but because it is painful when it is still to come." Okay, so I mean, the idea there is you shouldn't fear death when it's not here yet, because it's not here yet, and you can't fear death thereafter, because when you're dead, you're not alive anymore, you're not around anymore. "For that which, while present, causes no distress, causes unnecessary pain when merely anticipated. So death, the most frightening of bad things, is nothing to us. It's nothing to us. Since when we exist, death is not yet present. And when death is present, then we do not exist. We've gone out of existence." Okay, so he says, yeah, many people think that death is the greatest of all evils. But in fact, we should come to think that death is nothing to us. And once we recognize that it's nothing to us, because it's really the first moment of our forever non-existence, then we won't fear it, or we shouldn't fear it. least we should strive to not fear it. He thinks, we will fear it, but we should strive not to. That's the best case scenario. Okay, so that's just a little passage from Epicurus, where he developed something like what we've come to know as his death argument. And I just got it kind of captured here in premise conclusion form. So there's interpretive work here. Some people interpret Epicurus a little differently than others, but this is a standard way of interpreting Epicurus and his death argument that we can abstract from the passage that we just read, these parts of the passage that we just read. So one, something is bad for someone only if it's experienced by that someone. Okay, so badness depends on experience. And we're talking about badness for someone here. So we're talking about badness in the sense of well-being. Someone's well-being is compromised, or things are going poorly for someone in terms of their well-being, right? Only if it's in some sense grounded and or based in experience that individual is having. So then by one, we get two, don't we? Death is bad for someone or bad for the person who dies, only if it is experienced by the person who dies. So here, all we've done really is taken the variables in one, something and someone, and given them values in two. So something is given the value of death in two, and then someone is given the value of the person that dies. So that's why I say so. We're concluding from one to two is just an instance of one where we just filled in the variables. So two, again, death is bad for the person that dies, only if it's experienced by the person that dies. We can even go more general. Death is bad for the individual that dies or the being that dies, only if it's experienced by that person or by that individual or by that being that dies. And then three, independent premise, but death can't be experienced by the person that dies. So from 2 and 3, we get 4. So the 2 and 3 here just says, basically is just saying that just by logic, we get to 4. Okay. And we get to 2 just by 1. This is just an instance of 1. We filled in some of the variables with values. And then this is a premise. A premise that could indeed be supported, couldn't it? So I think we understand 1, we understand 2. Why I think that death can't be experienced by the person that dies? Because death is being understood as the permanent end of existence. So death is the first moment of someone's non-existence. And so death can't be experienced by that individual because experience requires existence. Isn't that right? That seems to be pretty golden, doesn't it? So the support for 3 is going to involve something like that. If you're to try to explain it a little bit. This would be the basic principle. Right. And then under 2, you could, support for 2 is just going to be, and this is an instance of 1. Variables are given values. Okay. And then for someone like Epicurus, if you're interested, Epicurus who's a hedonist. So badness is going to be understood in terms of pain, right? So Epicurus was a hedonist. But of course, you could be another type of experience-based theorist of well-being, and this could be true for you as well. So long as goodness and badness in terms of our well-being are defined in terms of experience, you could accept one. So Epicurus was a hedonist, which maintains that badness is defined in terms of pain to the individual. Right. So if it's new to you, what's going on here is we're building up to 4. 1 through 3 are premises that we run to try to support a conclusion. And the conclusion here follows from 2 and 3. We could have really began with 2 if we wanted to, and supported 2 with something like 1. That would have been fine too. I just lengthened it a little bit here. But yeah, there is a logical rule that allows us to go from 2 to 3 to 4. That death is not bad for the person that dies or for the individual that dies. Okay, so even if we're not translating Epicurus exactly the way he intended to be translated, this is a common way of understanding the death argument from Epicurus. Certainly Bradley would understand it this way when we get to him. Okay, so a couple notes here, 3 notes here, which I've already anticipated. So death is, the concept of death is that of the permanent end of existence. There might be other concepts of death that that one could think about when thinking about death. But this is at least one that's available to us. And as a matter of like empirical fact, Epicurus claimed that death, the permanent end of our existence, occurs when we physically die. But of course, one could disagree with Epicurus on that. Does that make sense? One could think, oh no, when I physically die, my soul, some maybe immaterial or non-physical part of me goes on existing. But then when we're thinking about death as a permanent end of existence, you can imagine thinking about the soul going out of existence permanently, couldn't you? It's a possibility anyways. Okay. What I said there is a bit at odds with something Bradley says early on in this paper, but we'll get there. And then B, the concept of death is distinct from the concept of dying. So that's another thing to keep in mind. So dying is this process that culminates in death. So of course, dying can be experienced. It's death that can't be experienced if we're thinking about death as a permanent end of existence. So it might be that physical. So let's suppose that there's something non-physical about us that can survive death. Suppose I physically die. In that case, physical death can be experienced so long as there's an afterlife, right? It's just that if then that soul, which is us or something like that, dies, and we understand that as that death being our permanent end of existence, we can think about that as the relevant permanent end. Okay. So one of the reasons I note that is just at the outset is because, I note these things just because some people will confuse death and dying. Sometimes the way we talk lends to that confusion. So I don't think anybody's to be blamed for that. And then we can disagree with the details of Epicurus's view on when the permanent end of existence is, yet still have a meaningful discussion with him. So that way we're not just talking past each other. We want to make sure that when Epicurus is talking about death and we're responding to Epicurus by talking about death, we have the same concept in mind, or at least enough of the same concept in mind, so we're not just at cross purposes in our discussion. Maybe not with Epicurus, but with an Epicurean. And then lastly, Epicureanism at death just generally is a thesis that death is not bad for the individual that dies, as I've anticipated. So one could be an Epicurean about death and reject this argument and have some other argument in place of it for their Epicureanism. That's certainly possible, and they're contemporary Epicureans. If you're interested, David Hirschonov, he's an Epicurean. He wrote this paper, 2007, A More Palatable Epicureanism. So he develops it. And his development of it is different from Epicurus, the historical Epicurus, but he still is an Epicurean, just in case you were curious. Okay, so those are some notes to the argument. Now some challenges. I just only put one challenge. It's the case of the perfect cheater. And so we come back up to the argument, and we're to imagine someone who's a perfect cheater. And part of what it means to be a perfect cheater is that the cheater in question is so good at cheating that he never gets caught. So he cheats regularly on his partner, never gets caught doing so, and is so good at cheating that his partner would never guess that he's cheating either. So he's concealed it so perfectly. Okay, sometimes when I teach that, someone says, "Oh, I dated that person." Um, if so, too bad. But yeah, so we have this perfect cheater, and then like imagine the person who's being cheated on now, the victim in the case. She never experiences the cheating. Remember, we're talking about a perfect cheater here. And we define the perfect cheater in part. There's a case being made, isn't there, that even though the person who's being cheated on, the victim, it's bad for her that she's being cheated on, despite the fact that she never experiences it. There's at least a case to be made for this. And if that's right, then something could be bad for someone, right, even if it's not experienced by that someone. Okay, so if you're moved by the case and it seems rather convincing, that gives you reason to reject premise one, doesn't it? The way you challenge the first premise here would be to say something can be bad for someone, or something is bad for someone more exactly, even if it's not experienced by that someone. And here we're thinking about the victim in the case of the perfect cheater. Like it would make perfect sense if, like, for whatever reason, you and I knew about it and we were, sitting next to each other, and somehow we were able to detect what's going on, and for whatever reason um, we would never tell the victim. We didn't have access to the victim or something. Tell your favorite story as to why. It would be fine if we said something like, she doesn't know how bad off she is. And that's maybe some linguistic support, or I don't know, conversational support that um, that lends credence to the perfect cheater case. If that case doesn't do it for you, of course, you can multiply examples. Cases like where um, you you believe that your family loves you, your teachers think that you're a great student, your employers think that you're an awesome employee, right? But they all hate your guts. You know what I mean? They're perfect though at deceiving you about these things. Um, you never could find out about it for whatever reason. I guess some people think about the Truman Show when they think about these kinds of cases. Um, Again, if there is something to these cases, they seem to elicit that you're worse off than you even know about, worse off than you're experiencing, because everyone is loving and kind and nice to your face, but they hate your guts really. Um, these kinds of cases, they lend support to one being challenged, and then we've got a challenged Epicurus' argument for his Epicurean view. So of course, once one is challenged, then our support for two falls by the wayside. So death could then be bad for the person that dies, even if that person doesn't experience it. So that's sort of driving home the force of the challenges to one. Is then when we go to two, we have principled grounds for saying, there might be cases where death is bad for the individual that dies, even if that individual doesn't experience it, even if the individual can't experience the death that is in line with what premise three claims. And premise three just might be golden at the end of the day, right? This principle seems like it's really, really solid. Okay. Okay, so the anti-Epicurean view, the main view that you'd see out there in the literature is the deprivation view. This is Bradley's view. Okay, so Bradley is going to reject ultimately the Epicurus argument for the Epicurean view above. This is oftentimes taken to be the common sense view, the view that insofar as you think that death is at least sometimes bad for the individual that dies, you're going to think something like this theory is true. And so I try to capture it here, hopefully clearly. So death is bad for the individual that dies, according to the deprivation theory, at least one way of formulating it, if, and perhaps only if. I put the and only if in parentheses because you don't need it for the deprivation theory, but depends on how strong you want your deprivation theory to be. So again, death is bad for the individual that dies if, and perhaps only if, death deprives the individual that dies of a valuable future. So you think about all the goods that you're deprived of, you know. So one common challenge to the Epicurean, who follows Epicurus pretty closely, with perhaps being a hedonist or some other experience-based well-being theorist. The challenge involves saying, well, isn't it bad that that individuals miss out on the pleasures or the other experiences that are enjoyable or otherwise good for the individual who experiences them? And the Epicurean oftentimes struggles with this kind of challenge. They miss out on, they're deprived of. Those mean roughly the same thing, at least across a wide range of cases. So you think about, like, this is like a weak view of the deprivation theory. It would just include the if, and a stronger view would include the if and only if. And perhaps you got the gist of Bradley's view. Maybe you were able to detect what his view is if you've given it a chance, at least part of it. He ends up going for the stronger view, it turns out. He uses terms, I think he uses terms like when and because, or when and only when, or terms like those. Yeah, I think his initial formulation is death is bad for the individual that dies when and because. Alternatively, here's another way of putting it. If even though I think this is probably the most intuitive way of putting it, this is maybe a helpful way of seeing it laid out. Death is bad for the individual that dies if, and again, perhaps only if, death adversely affects the lifetime well-being of the individual that dies. Adversely or negatively affects the well-being level of the individual that dies. To go to my whiteboard here, quote unquote whiteboard, we're to sort of graph this out a little bit here. Imagine, so this would be a deprivation theory, DT for deprivation theory, and then BD, badness of death. So deprivation theory, the badness of death for the person that dies. It could be a really lengthy title of a position. So DTBD for short. So you can imagine, like, here's the well-being scale on an axis. Here's our time axis. So we've got years, well-being levels. Let's just suppose 1,000 units of well-being is really, really high, and 100 years is a long time to live. Let's suppose someone lives to 70. Let's suppose someone lives to, let's go 30 years. And then, but if they hadn't died at 30, they would have lived to 75. So they live 45 more years. So let's just suppose that someone, lives, a good life. Things just continue to get better and better and better. They're not venturing down into the negatives, right? So I kept everything on the positives to simplify, but it is possible that you can imagine people, going down to the negative levels, unwell-being levels. But just imagine this person, it just gets better and better as time goes on, right? And then boom, at 30, just dies. Let's hope painlessly, quickly. And then what we could do is we could just, this is all the well-being that was accrued in the lifetime of this individual. But had this individual not died, then this individual would have gone on, as I said, to live to 75. And you might be wondering, what's this dip right here? Let's imagine this someone, at right before he died, he signed up for honor social. He signed up for ethics. Phil 331 at Cal Poly, and it just took a nosedive. It was pretty bad for a while. It took him some time. Took him some time to recover, and they finally got back going again. This little dip is just explained by taking Phil 331, for a bit, but he took off and. and then end up, having a quick, let's say, painless death at 75. And here, look at all this well-being that this individual would have experienced were he not to have died here at 30. Okay, so this is the well-being deprived of. So we see that death at this point adversely affects the lifetime well-being levels, because when we compare the actual life with the life that would have been lived were death not to have happened, we see that the individual would have had more lifetime well-being. So that's the way of capturing this idea of there being adverse effect on lifetime well-being. Okay. Yeah, so well-being up to 30, would live to 75, boom. Okay, so that's a way of seeing the view laid out graphically. There are Epicurean challenges to deprivation theory, though, that are just worth mentioning by way of introducing this topic of death. A little bit of back and forth here. So the Epicurean challenges the no subject problem. So according to the deprivation theorist, the deprivation theorist typically accepts the claim that that death is the permanent end of existence for the individual that dies. And if that's right, then the Epicurean responds by saying, who is death bad for? Because death is a permanent end of existence for the individual that dies. So we call this a no subject problem. The deprivation theorist usually claims, oh, it's the person that dies. And then the Epicurean responds like, okay, but there is nobody there for death to be bad for. So there's an issue of the no subject problem. Okay. A related problem is the timing problem. So this is the issue of like when death is bad for the person that dies. And so we consider the possibilities here, like when could death be bad for the person who dies? It could be bad for the person who dies prior to the death, at the moment of death, right, or after the death, right? Those are the three like logical possibilities. And the Epicurean says it's not bad for the person before she dies, right? Because death isn't there yet. Death hasn't happened yet. What may be bad is fearing death, anticipating death, but not death itself. At death, there's nobody there. Remember, at the moment of death is the moment of non-existence. So there's no one there for death to be bad for. And then afterwards, there's no one there either, after that initial moment of death. So it doesn't look like there's a time at which death is bad for the individual that dies. There's no time at which the individual is deprived of anything. So you see this is related to the no subject problem, because when we're talking about all the various times that death could be bad, at least in logical space, for the individual that dies, right, we discussed how, or we responded by, the Epicurean responded by claiming like there's no one there, right, for death to be bad for, at least in the last two options. The first option, prior to death, well, death isn't there yet, but even if the individual is there. But at least for the last two options, there's some overlap with the no subject problem. So when is death bad? So there are some philosophers who have claimed that it's true to say that death is bad for some individuals. There's some philosophers who claim that death is always bad for the individual that dies. One response, kind of a classic response out there, is that there's no time at which death is bad for the individual that dies. Or when we take the claim, death is bad for some individual, let's say X. When we say that, some say there's just no time at which that claim is true. And a support for this, sometimes they'll say things like, well, take the claim that Lincoln is taller than Napoleon, or Lincoln was taller than Napoleon. Pick your favorite example if there's another one that works for you. At what time is it true to say that? So it seems like it's true to say that, but it doesn't seem like there's any time at which it's true. So there's some precedence for maintaining that there's just no time at which it's bad for the person who dies. A lot of philosophers don't like that argument, though, or that response to the timing problem. Bradley, for example, he thinks that he's a deprivation theorist, as you know. He thinks that death is bad for the individual that dies at all those times that he would have experienced those good things. So if you go back to our graph here, death is bad for the individual that dies at all these times. At all those times that the individual would have experienced, right, the good things, the things that made his or her life go well. So that's one way of going. It's not problem free, of course, but it gives you a sense of how to respond to it. All right, and then the asymmetry problem is a challenge to the deprivation theory itself. So the deprivation theory, as we know, just thinking about the simple formulation here, death is bad for the individual that dies if death deprives the individual that dies of a valuable future. Well, according to the asymmetry problem, then it should be the case that not having been born sooner is bad for the individual that dies, because it also deprives the individual that's not born earlier or sooner, right, of the valuable experiences or the valuable past or whatever it is, right? However we wanted to revise that. But alternatively, not having been born sooner for the individual that wasn't born sooner, right, adversely affects lifetime well-being level of the individual that wasn't born sooner. Okay, so that looks like the asymmetry problem is going to provide a problem directly to the deprivation theory. So some philosophers don't find this problem in Epicurus anywhere. They find it in an Epicurean, a Roman Epicurean philosopher later after Epicurus named Lucretius, if you're interested. Okay, so if death is bad for the individual that dies, right, because death adversely affects lifetime well-being level of the individual that dies, then it should be the case that that not having been born sooner is bad for the individual that wasn't born sooner, because it's going to adversely affect the lifetime well-being level of the person or the individual that wasn't born sooner. Of course, that's all of us, right? We all could have been born sooner in a sense, it's according to the objection. One kind of response here is just that our origins are essential to us. So there's a sense in which it's impossible for us to have been born sooner. So the thought here is at least one way of spelling out the thought. It's a common way of spelling out the thought is that our biological origins are our origins, and our biological origins are dependent on when our parents conceived us, right? So, had our parents not conceived us when they did, then we wouldn't have been, is the idea. Other people would have come into existence. And there's debate about this, as you can imagine, but it's one way of responding. So you can say, the reason why it's not bad not to have been born sooner is because I couldn't have been born sooner. It's impossible for that to be the case. My origins, when I came into existence, they're necessary. Okay. So you see all kinds of really cool issues crop up when we think about death. But typically, we're going to begin with Epicurus and then go from there. Any questions or comments, concerns about anything that I've noted? Anything needing clarifying? All right, so let's go to the Bradley paper real quick. So this is from the Rutledge Handbook of Philosophy of Well-Being. And Bradley's also recently written a work titled Just Well-Being. It's a pretty short survey on theories of well-being. It's an opinionated survey. He likes these opinionated surveys. I just wanted to point to something before moving on to a PowerPoint presentation I put together. So he wrote here, I will, in what follows, I will assume that there's no afterlife. So it's a very common assumption among those who write on death. I'll continue. If there were an afterlife, most of the interesting philosophical puzzles about the badness of death would disappear and be replaced by relatively banal epistemological problems. How can we know what the afterlife is like? Will it be good or bad for us, etc.? So here I think that that even if there is an afterlife, beyond the physical, we could still ask, were the afterlife to end permanently for the person who experiences an afterlife? Would it be bad for that? Would it be bad for that person? So I actually think that Bradley's not right about this here. And I tried to capture that in my discussion earlier. I said I would come and try to point out in the Bradley where there's a minor disagreement. I don't think this should bog us down any, but I don't think that the questions are just going to be relatively banal. They're still going to be really good questions. You make it to the afterlife, suppose, just for argument's sake, right? Would it be bad for you to stop existing after you made it to the afterlife? So there just might be an assumption here that if you make it to the afterlife, well, you're in the clear forever, right? And continue living thereafter. But that's to build in some pretty heavy-duty assumptions about what the afterlife is like, what it involves, how long it lasts, etc. And we didn't make any of those assumptions. I mean, even if you did think that the afterlife was permanent, right? You could still ask, were it not permanent, would it be bad for the person who dies? So I do think that the philosophical puzzles remain, the heavy-duty ones remain. Okay. And then he says, I will assume furthermore that when one dies, one goes out of existence altogether rather than existing as a corpse. Fred Feldman calls this a termination thesis. Basically, the idea is you out of existence, it's just like a blank forever. If that makes you start feeling a little queasy on the inside, maybe that's where you start doing philosophy. Feel like you're just kind of looking over the edge of a cliff and you start thinking about death as it's over forever. Let that sink in a little bit, right? I mean, forever. I mean, it's not like you're like behind some window just watching everything go on, because then you'd be, right? You'd be existing. It's over blank. That's what the termination thesis is. Forever. Okay, I'll shut up. I don't want anybody to get upset. And Feldman, he has this really, really weird view. If you're interested, you can look up the paper, Fred Feldman, and I think the title of the paper has corpse in it. I didn't get it up. I ran out of time. It did cross my mind. But he actually argues that when we die, we exist as a corpse for a while, a long while. I'll shut up. I'll let you think about that. I'll let you ruminate on that one. But a lot of people think that's a pretty wonky view. He's pretty interesting as an arguer, though. Okay, he's pretty interesting and really clear too. Okay. Bradley disagrees with Feldman. Feldman was one of Bradley's teachers, and Bradley was one of my teachers in graduate school. All right, so let's go ahead and drop that down, segue. Hopefully you're all doing good. Death, a misfortune. So there's a reason why we use this terminology, misfortune. Okay, so there's Bradley. He's sitting here. This is at Syracuse University. This is our graduate seminar room. It's called the Deedle Room. So welcome to the Deedle Room. He's a well-being hedonist. But when it comes to value, he says maybe justice or virtue counts as intrinsically good. It just isn't intrinsically good for us. He's a consequentialist. We'll get to consequentialism later. So he's in the utilitarian tradition. I do think he is it just a consequentialist. I don't think he identifies as a utilitarian though. Um, and then he's a deprivation theorist, so he's anti-Epicurean in that way. He thinks it's really, really natural to say that death is at least sometimes bad for the person who dies, for the individual that dies. He thinks that death is even bad for animals. So if you're interested, he wrote a paper recently called "Is Death Bad for a Cow?" And he answers that question in the affirmative. Is death bad for a cow? Okay. All right, so I've already anticipated these assumptions. These are assumptions by and large that Bradley assumes. So death and dying are distinct. We know the difference between those. Death is a permanent end of existence, and physical death marks a permanent end of the end for death's victim. Really for everyone though, more than just death's victim, but for everyone. Supposing that death doesn't make all of us victims. And I already captured the idea. This is just a termination thesis. Okay, so the key question is this for Bradley? Is death a misfortune for its victim? If we go to the Bradley, what do I do with it? Go to the Bradley here, just so we can understand him a little bit. So he says, let us begin with the most obvious way in which well-being is connected to death. According to the most popular view about what makes death a misfortune, the deprivation account, death is bad because it deprives its victim of the good things in life. That is, death is a misfortune because and when it results in a net loss of well-being to the victim. This thought is understood counterfactually. So death, I'll read the passage here, see if we can come back and understand a bit better. This thought is understood counterfactually, counter to factually. Death is a misfortune for its victim if and only if the victim would have been better off overall if she had not died then. Okay. Furthermore, how bad it is to die is determined by how much good the victim is deprived of. So we have like the extent to which death is bad for the individual that dies being determined by how much goodness the individual who died is deprived of. Furthermore, how bad it is to die is determined by how much good the victim is deprived of. To repeat myself, that is how much better her life would have been if she had not died then. Okay. If her life would have been worse had she not died, for example, if she was in excruciating pain with no hope of relief, then her death is not harmful for her. So you might imagine like, standard classic cases of euthanasia here. Euthanasia being the source of the death, where someone's put out of their painful misery. But it's beneficial for her, in fact. A nice feature of the deprivation account is that it does not require us to take a stand on the controversial question of which is the correct theory of well-being. Right, so Bradley, he is a hedonist when it comes to well-being, but you don't have to be a hedonist to be a deprivation theorist. Okay, that can get worked out separately. Okay. Let me just come back to this idea. We'll talk about it again when we get to the PowerPoint presentation, a bit deeper into it. This idea of counterfactuals is just worth making a note about here. So, counterfactual sentences. So counterfactuals are a kind of sentence, they're kind of conditional sentence. So conditional sentences are of the form, like if X, then Y. Just to give you the rough form. And then a counterfactual conditional is a kind of conditional that we use all the time. It's if X had been the case, it wasn't in fact the case, but if it had been the case, then Y would have been, or Y would have happened, or Y would have occurred, or some such. So so we think about conditionals like if X then Y just generally as like, these are sometimes called indicative conditionals because they're like in the indicative tense. The counterfactual sense is where we have an if part that is not true. So we're kind of considering it hypothetically to wonder what follows from it. So that's what it means to talk about counterfactuals or something counterfactually. Death is a misfortune for its victim if and only if the victim would have been better off overall if she had not died then. So we consider someone who died, and then we think, okay, well, if she hadn't died then, right, then this would have happened. Namely, she would have had X amount of goodness or N amount of goodness. Does that make sense? So that's how we understand the deprivation account. We understand it counterfactually. And I tried to, in at least part of my presentation here when looking at the graph here, I tried to use some counterfactual language, which I think you naturally understood, right? If this individual, if Jones, for example, hadn't died at 30 years old at this time, right? If that hadn't happened, counterfactually, then Jones would have experienced all this goodness, especially after recovering from, Phil 331. Okay. Winter 21. Okay. Post 2020. Okay. So hopefully that made sense. Oops. Or maybe go back to Bradley just real quick here. Okay, so before we proceed, so this issue of death being a misfortune is something that Bradley wants to state why he's concerned with the issue of death being a misfortune to us, as opposed to death being bad, as I've introduced things. So before we proceed, we should note that terminology is sometimes disputed. Here are 3 questions we might ask about death. Question 1, is death bad for its victim? Question 2, is death a misfortune for its victim? And 3, is death harmful to its victim? He notes, I have so far intentionally treated these synonymously in order to show how natural it is to treat them in this way, as if they all meant the same thing, right? Misfortune, badness, and harmfulness, all meaning the same thing. But some have argued that death can be comparatively bad, in the deprivationist sense described in the previous paragraph, without being a misfortune, without being harmful. Okay, simply failing to get some positive well-being, for instance, by failing to find Aladdin's lamp is comparatively bad for you, but it may nevertheless not be a misfortune or a harm, as it does not merit any sort of distress. Okay, so all parties seem to agree that death is comparatively bad. At the very least, it's going to be comparatively bad, for the individual that dies. So let us, all those who are deprivation theorists. So let us, even anti-deprivation theorists can, I think, maintain that too, if I'm right. So all parties seem to agree that death is comparatively bad. So let us instead focus on question 2, is death a misfortune for its victim? The idea here is when we ask the question, is death bad? It could mean, is death intrinsically bad, or is it comparatively bad? And so in order to sidestep that ambiguity, he's just going to focus on misfortune. Okay. So everyone, and I think literally everyone, can accept that death is at least comparatively bad for its victim, right? In the sense that maybe some would say that it's better to be, it's worse to be dead than it is to be alive, or some such, right? Right. Yeah, so this case of finding Aladdin's lamp is like really an interesting one. So it's comparatively bad, right? That you don't find Aladdin's lamp, which would give you the wishes to make your life go superbly for you. That could be comparatively bad for you that you don't get it, but it's not like intrinsically bad for you. It's not bad for you in a way that we say like matters. That's another way sometimes it's put in the literature. Okay, so that's at least one reason why, or at least the reason in the text that Bradley cites for his using this language here, is death a misfortune for its victim, as opposed to is death bad for its victim. Is death a misfortune for the individual that dies? If we want to put it that way. This is Bradley's theory. He's a deprivation theorist. But here you see the strength of the view. It's an if and only if view, so it's a strong view. Meaning it's really the only game in town in accounting for the badness of death for the individual that dies. So if you think about just the if part, if we were to cross out the the and only if part for a moment, if we were to do that. So death is a misfortune for the person who dies if death adversely affects lifetime well-being level of the person who dies. This account is consistent with there being other explanations on offer for death being bad for the individual who dies. So you say this is just a sufficient condition for death being a misfortune for the person who dies. To follow Bradley's language more precisely in that way of putting it. But then once you get this, then it's not just sufficient condition, there's also a necessary condition. So in order for death to be misfortune for the individual that dies, it has to be the case that that individual is deprived of the goodness of life, to put it in that rough way. We could have done even a little bit further here. This is sort of a simple way of putting it, but we could also include death is a misfortune for the person who dies if and only if, and to the extent that, in order to capture that bit that Bradley emphasizes when laying out his view initially. So death can be more or less bad for someone. It comes in terms of degrees more accurately. So keep that in mind. I just kind of keep it simple here. So the negative effect of death adversely affects one's lifetime well-being if and only if one's death makes it the case that one has less well-being than one would have had were one not to have met one's death. That's putting things counterfactually. Okay. So the negative effect, the adverse effect on lifetime well-being. So we consider the time period that someone's alive up to their death. That's one lifetime. And then the other lifetime would be considering counterfactually the lifetime that includes all those times that the individual would have existed were they not to have died earlier. And that's the second lifetime. We compare those with each other. Okay, so there's 4 challenges to DTBD that Bradley considers. I think we'll get through we'll get through the first 3 probably, and then we'll have to pick up the 4th one next time is my guess. But it's not bad to maybe stop after 2 or 3 of them. Okay. So we have the ambiguity problem that's been developed in the literature against the deprivation view. And a way of capturing the ambiguity problem is to consider the Joan Rivers case. So this is Bradley's case. So I try to summarize them here with 1 and 2. So if JR, Joan Rivers, had not died and had never gone for a vocal cord operation before, she would have lived several years of happiness. Okay. So that seems like one possibility. And what kind of claim is this? This is a counterfactual claim, isn't it? Joan Rivers has died, so we imagine she had not died. And then we have this parenthetical which adds, right, a bit to the if part. And then we're saying this could have happened, or this would have resulted, right, had she not died and hadn't gone in for that vocal cord operation, which led to her demise. Okay. So just as by way of some terminology here, the if part we oftentimes call an antecedent. And then the next part we call the consequent. Like the consequence of the antecedent. So antecedent and consequent. And I have those spelled on other slides coming up. I just wanted to anticipate that now. And then here's another counterfactual claim. If JR, Joan Rivers, had not died after having had the botched operation, she would have lived a short time longer and not enjoyed her life very much. Okay. The thought is, it seems like these could both be true. These could both be true counterfactuals. Okay. So again, the antecedent, if Joan Rivers had not died after having had the botched operation, then because the operation was botched, then she would have probably suffered a great deal thereafter. Okay. So DTBD, following Bradley, requires that we evaluate the counterfactual claims involving the person who dies. In the Joan Rivers case, it's Joan Rivers. So we're required to evaluate claims of this form. So I mentioned earlier that I was going to talk more about counterfactuals in the presentation. So here's the the form roughly of the counterfactual claim. So that's relevant to DTBD. If X had not died, then X would have had N well-being levels, or levels of well-being, N some such would work. There's just a very generic form. And when we go back to the 1 and 2 here, the very same form, we just didn't precisify exactly how much well-being results from what we had built into the antecedents of the counterfactuals. So to get to the root of the ambiguity problem here, there are many possibilities that can be built into the antecedent of a counterfactual conditional. Right? From here, we can try to determine the value of N in the consequent. So the way in which I try to capture that, we can strengthen, sometimes it's called this way, strengthen the antecedent, is by building in these parentheticals. And there's all kinds of ways in which we can strengthen the antecedents. And then how we strengthen the antecedents is going to determine what the well-being level is, right, thereafter, right, in our consequent. And this is supposed to be a problem, at least according to those who are challenging deprivation theory. And Bradley's claim is, right, it doesn't affect the connection between death and well-being. DTBD is essentially a theory of that connection between death and well-being. So, so the idea is it's perfectly fine that there are these mixed results where this could be true and this could be true at the same time, because it will matter. The details are going to matter as how we strengthen our antecedents. But that's not a challenge to DTBD. It just means that the details are going to matter, and whether or not death is bad for the individual that dies. In this case, Joan Rivers. Okay. So that's Bradley's reply. Hopefully that's clear. It's a little abstract, I know, and sometimes it gets a little used to talking about counterfactuals, antecedents and consequence and the like, but if there are any issues, let me know. Okay, so that's the first problem. Second problem, the not all deprivations are a misfortune problem. Sorry, that's so wordy and lengthy, just messy. The not all deprivations are a misfortune problem. So, well, we know that the way Bradley's thinking about things is in terms of misfortune, for the reasons that were noted above. So DTBD relies on deprivations being misfortunes. So death is, bad for the individual that dies, if and only if, and to the extent that the individual that dies is deprived of the valuable future that he or she would have had were she not to have died. But those deprivations must be misfortunes. At the same time, they must be misfortunes. Okay. Okay, so you could think then deprivations are maybe the generic or the general concepts, or it's the deprivation is the generic concept, and then underneath it there's different kinds of deprivations. One such kind is a misfortune. Others might be harms, to use the terminology from the Bradley. And others are just maybe not misfortunes. I don't know, we classify them in various ways. Give them tags if we want to. No doubt there already are tags out there. But there's some counterexamples to this. So being deprived of Aladdin's lamp, to use Bradley's example, you're deprived of Aladdin's lamp, but you're not subject to misfortune as a result. Like, it's not a misfortune that you never came across Aladdin's lamp. Or perhaps a more realistic strategy, you can be deprived of winning the lottery. It's not a misfortune that you didn't win the lottery. Some of you might be disagreeing with me here on this point. Okay, but that's a counterexample that DTBD relies on these deprivations being misfortunes. No, wait a minute. What they're doing is what these examples here are showing is that right. So these counterexamples are showing that not all deprivations are misfortunes. Excuse me. But then, according to the challenge here, DTBD relies on deprivations being misfortunes, right? So then, there's a possible way in which we can revise the view so that way we get the result that we want, that this objection is kind of forcing us into. So a person P suffers from the misfortune of not acquiring X only if P could reasonably expect to have acquired X. So the thought here is it's not a misfortune, even though you're deprived of not getting Aladdin's lamp, that you didn't get Aladdin's lamp, because you couldn't reasonably expect to get Aladdin's lamp. Or in the lottery case, you don't suffer a misfortune with respect to not winning the lottery because you couldn't reasonably expect to have won the lottery. I mean, the odds are just stacked against you. Okay. So so not all deprivations are misfortunes. DTBD, remember, was at least according to some standard ways of laying out the view, relies on deprivations being misfortunes. Then we have these examples that challenge that reliance claim. So then this is a possible fix. Okay, so we can respond to these counterexamples, or these examples that challenge this reliance claim. Okay, good. So then a person P suffers a misfortune of not acquiring X. This is just the very same claim as on the previous slide. Only if P could reasonably expect to have acquired X. But then Bradley goes on to say, well, the person who doesn't get the cure for cancer suffers a misfortune, even though that person could not reasonably expect to have acquired it. So the aim was to try to deal with the Aladdin's lamp case and the lottery case. And then this seems to be like a viable solution. But then Bradley says, no, this doesn't work either. He issues his counterexample to this revised view. So then a person P could suffer the misfortune of not acquiring X, even if P could not reasonably expect to have acquired X. And that's captured by the cure for cancer case. Someone who's got cancer, suffering from cancer, right? They're suffering a misfortune, right? They're suffering a misfortune, the misfortune of not acquiring the cure for cancer, even though right? They couldn't reasonably expect to have acquired the cure for cancer. That's how you would, challenge a claim like this. So the attempted fix doesn't work. So then the upshot, if you're Bradley, is just, we're going to continue relying on this. Okay. And of course, more would have to be said, but he's kind of doing an opinionated survey as opposed to going into every little thing and trying to work out his view. He actually wrote a book called Well-Being and Death. So he's worked on a lot of these issues in detail. Okay. Okay, so let's just deal with the desires problem, and then that should be sufficient for today. So DTBD, remember, the deprivation theory, the badness of death, as generally stated, is false. It is not properly qualified. So I'm kind of building up and stating the desires problem. So a way of fleshing one out is by thinking about two. Candidates for being a victim of death must include the desire to live or having a desire for continued existence. Okay, so DTBD, again, it's too general. It needs to be properly restricted such that we have only a certain set of candidates for death, for being a victim of death. And this is the relevant qualification. Such candidates must include having the desire to live or having the desire for continued existence. I'm going to include a having in here real quick. The candidates must have these desires. So 3, death is bad for the person P who dies only if P desires continued existence at the time of death. So we build this into DTBD somehow. So we've got the generic DTBD that Bradley lays out. And then the challenge here is, okay, we need to include this other necessary condition. That makes sense. So we add this to DTBD, this point 3 here. So death is bad for the person who dies, if and only if P, so we have P here, death is bad for the person P who dies, if and only if P is deprived of a valuable future, and only if P desires continued existence at the time of death. So that's the way of thinking about it. We're adding this to DTBD to restrict it. So the desires problem continued. Consider the case where Tuan desires to continue living, but his future promise is much more badness than goodness. Okay. It looks like DTBD is going to predict that death isn't bad for Tuan. Right? So Tuan wants to go on living, but he's going to suffer greatly in his future. That can be predicted. DTBD predicts that death isn't bad for Tuan. The objector who's building in 3 to DTBD is going to say, look, we can explain why death is bad for Tuan because he desires to continue living. But just generic old DTBD a la Bradley is going to get the wrong result. It's going to predict that death isn't bad for Tuan because there's no such qualification about desiring continued existence. And then B, moreover, if Tuan is killed, DTBD struggles to account for the wrongness of killing. So very often there's a connection. It might even just be a loose connection, but there's a connection nonetheless, it seems, between those who accept a deprivation theory, the badness of death, and they're making available to themselves, accepting a pretty intuitive account of the wrongness of killing, which is also deprivation theory. That one explains why it's wrong to kill someone, at least in many instances, is that the person who is killed is deprived of a valuable future. That makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? So if you accept DTBD of some form, then it makes sense to accept, DTWK, deprivation theory, the wrongness of killing. So if generical DTBD is going to struggle to account for the badness of Tuan's death, then the argument here is it also going to struggle to explain or account for the wrongness of killing Tuan, supposing Tuan were killed? So the issue of what, in ethics, of what accounts or what explains why it's wrong to kill someone it's a pretty important thing to work out. And again, one common view out there is a deprivation theory. It makes it wrong to kill me when I'm killed, or if I'm killed. Is that, at least, at least generally, there might be other reasons available, but it's just because you've prevented me from enjoying the good future I was going to live, I was going to have. And I just captured the DTWK here, the deprivation theory, the wrongness of killing. Killing person P is wrong if killing P deprives P of a valuable future, or if killing P adversely affects P's lifetime well-being levels. So you see, it's just very similar in form to DTBD. It's just we're replacing the badness of death with the wrongness of killing. And typically DTWK views involve just an if claim. So there could be other things that explain the wrongness of killing. So it could still be wrong to kill Tuan, even if his future promises more badness than goodness, right? You still want an account of that. So, something else is going to explain why it'd be, wrong to kill Tuan in those cases. Okay. So what does Bradley say in response to these issues? Because Bradley doesn't want to have to qualify his DTBD ultimately to, right, admit this, to admit 3. So Bradley ends up biting the bullet. He claims that death is not bad for Tuan if his future promises more badness than goodness. If Tuan were not to have died, then Tuan would have suffered more than enjoying existing. He bites the bullet. But then there's a second problem, right? Is, well, then can you explain why it'd be wrong to kill Tuan? And Bradley says, sure, some killings are wrong despite there being no harm. So Tuan isn't harmed by death. He doesn't suffer a misfortune by dying. But there can be, wrong killings even in cases where there's no harm or misfortunes in the death. So it's wrong for Tuan to have been killed, but Tuan is not harmed by the killing. Okay, now of course you'd have to say more, like, well, what it's going to account for the wrongness, but this is at least a start. Okay, so Bradley then goes on to consider cases where people temporarily cease desiring continued existence. Their deaths can still be bad for them. So here, right, what Bradley's doing is he's saying, look, you want to build in this condition, right? Death is bad for the person P who dies only if P desires continued existence. But Bradley wants to say that condition is way too strong. So death is bad for people, or death can be bad for individuals who die, even if they don't desire continued existence, right, at the time of their deaths. And so this is like the Tuan case. This is a Bradley inspired case. This is a case that I developed, from Bradley, just using a bit of creative license. But I'm capturing Bradley's point. So so again, consider cases where people temporarily cease desiring continued existence. Their deaths can still be bad for them. And here's an easy example. You lived in 2020. Well, suppose Tuan did. Well, my friend Tuan did. Suppose Tuan is really depressed about 2020 for various reasons. Just pick your favorite, there's a bunch. He loses his desire to live for a while. Maybe we didn't go that far, but you can imagine many did. But he is mistaken about how well his future will go for him. His death would be bad for him, all things being equal. Right? So, Tuan could just be mistaken about how 2021, 2022, 2023, all the way to 2030 is going to go for him. It's going to be so great. It's going to, outweigh everything thereafter even. But he's lost his desire to live now. You'd be mistaken, right? You'd be mistaken in thinking that his death isn't bad for him. And it'd be a mistake to think that his desire for continued living is required for his death to be bad for him. At least broadly argues. Okay, the psychological connectedness problem, the fourth objection, that takes some work. So let's hang tight on that one. Any clarifications I can offer on anything? Okay, then I'll go ahead and stop there. And I guess I wish you all a great night and be in touch. If not, I'll see you on Thursday. Thanks for coming.
Have a good night.
Be well.
Thank you.
Thank you.